Well, welcome everyone to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. We've got an exciting guest today. So we've got Elle Hardy. Now, Elle is an accomplished Australian journalist who these days is usually based in the UK or the US. And Elle's written for The Monthly, The Times, GQ, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Vice magazine, and the ABC, just to name a few. But I guess what's drawn us today to have a chat to Elle is her new book, Beyond Belief: How Pentecostal Christianity is Taking Over the World. And Troy and I have been fortunate enough to read the book, and it's an awesome read. And for people who were in Pentecostalism, I didn't know a lot of that history. How about you, Troy? Were you aware of a lot of that history before you read the book and the craziness?
Not all of it, of course, but a lot of it I was quite familiar with because I did a lot of that research into the Revival Centre's Pentecostal cult. And so the history of Pentecostalism was definitely something that I was familiar with. But I think whether you've been in Pentecostalism for a while or you've never been in Pentecostalism or you've left, this is still a must-read book. There is no doubt. I'm going to throw that right out there at the start and gush for you, Elle.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely brilliant book and definitely worth reading.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just thrilled that you read it, and that it's people that have been in inside the tent, so to speak, have enjoyed it. That's really important to me. So thanks very much.
It's good that you picked up on the tent analogy because it was often like tent revivals, Al. So you're right. We were inside the tent. I've given you a little bit of an intro, but besides your bio, that's the stuff that we get off websites and Wiki and wherever else we can get it. Who's Elle Hardy and what led you to write this book?
Who am I? God, that's a question. So I'm a journo, and I guess kind of inveterate traveller. Even before I became a journo, I just used to, pack up from my job every year or two and go traveling to some crazy places. So just always interested in, kind of more far-flung parts of the earth and whatnot, and was able to kind of merge that into journalism a few 6 or 7 years ago now. And I've been pretty lucky. I've been doing a fair bit of foreign correspondence and mainly kind of settled in America a few years ago, though I'm not especially based there now. And I was doing a story on this John School movement, which is sort of the air quotes anti-sex trafficking, anti-modern slavery movement that a lot of Pentecostal groups are running. And these people just didn't really want me following them around. They're pretty, 2018 red Texas. They weren't, thrilled by the fake news media. And they, kind of after a few days when they'd made it pretty difficult for me once I was down there to kind of meet up with them and follow them around despite inviting me there, I came to realize that the inspiration for starting their school was Christine Kane, who is an Australian woman who's a Hillsong alumni. And she had done a TED talk or something like that. And she's really prominent. She's one of two very prominent women in this anti-human trafficking movement.
Her name will be very familiar to a lot of our listeners, by the way, Christine Kane, being an Australian Pentecostal.
Yeah, okay, cool. I wasn't sure how well known she is here because I know obviously A21, which is the big organization that's really behind that stuff, is probably bigger in the US and places like that. So she was, and then she started to really fascinate me. So I wound up doing another story on her. And just in the course of doing these couple of stories, I was just reading a lot of stuff and trying to get my head around the Pentecostal movement. And there wasn't really any stuff in the press. And so I was sort of having to go and chat to academics and there's, so many really great people studying this stuff in universities all over the world, and was reading about it. And it was really just, wow, there's this huge global story happening that no one really seems to be on. A lot of people working in media are like myself, generally pretty secular, liberal, middle-class kind of people, that it's kind of can quite easily miss a story like Pentecostalism. And I just got super fascinated by it. And, I'm really interested in, kind of big global stories, I guess. And it was just an excuse as well to travel to a few pretty cool places that I hadn't been yet. So kind of merged all three. And I was just speaking to a lot of journo friends, and no one had heard, about 600 million Pentecostals and all that kind of stuff. So I think I wrote what I think is probably the first kind of non-academic book that looks at it as a global phenomenon. It's just really hoping to make people aware of something that's quite significant and, I guess kind of hopefully start a conversation around that.
Well, we're really glad you noticed because there is a lot going on in the Pentecostal world. And when we did our research into you, it says, we discovered you're raised a Catholic. but you also describe yourself as agnostic. So does that mean you've gone into research and writing this book with an openness that some of this may be genuine and of substance, or was it more sort of investigative?
Yeah, look, a bit of both, but I certainly had my mind opened a lot more in the process, actually. I think that was quite interesting. As I said, raised vaguely Catholic, but kind of once my grandpa died and stuff, we didn't have to go to church anymore. Which, and everyone has their various things. But it's kind of, when you're a kid and you don't have to spend your Sunday at church anymore, it can be exciting. Look, I got pretty into new atheism when that was kind of a big thing. And so part of this, I think, was atoning for my sins a bit, because I think in the end, it kind of made me, that movement made me and a lot of other people, I think, a bit nasty politically and a bit, very judgmental and, sort of treating people that believe like they're a bit stupid. And I know that I certainly kind of fell into that, for a few years almost. And it, just I think made me a worse person. So in some ways it was just funny that this kind of fell in my lap. It was really cool to meet a lot of people and understand, what Pentecostalism is giving people, which I think, is really not very well understood, that it's so much about the here and now and improving your material conditions, particularly, in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Look, and I went in, I came out of it, I think, with a much more open mind. And, there's a piece that I do on faith healing in the book in South Africa and Mozambique. And I know some researchers have gone out from American universities and kind of studied some of this faith healing that was going on in Mozambique. And I did kind of and they're pretty convinced that, something happened. It doesn't always work. It doesn't just mean that, you can stand up out of the wheelchair. But I did find myself kind of believing that, when miracles are the only game in town, sometimes they could happen. And I guess I'm just pretty comfortable now and as just someone that thinks that, there are things that we don't know and don't understand in the world. And I actually kind of like that, probably much more so than when I used to be think that I was a lot more certain about things.
So it's interesting, just to pick up on that point. In the book, you do say that in Africa, you really wanted to experience a miracle. Did that happen for you?
No, it didn't. I did go through a full kind of faith healing process with quite a nice kind of small time preacher who really just does want to help people. And, another time he just would have been a sangoma, a traditional African healer. And it's the whole process is very syncretic. It doesn't necessarily feel so Christian or Pentecostal. It's very obviously infused with the local culture, and that's what Pentecostals are so good at. They look and sound like the place that they're from. It's Hillsong would be, fairly unrecognizable to some people in inner city Johannesburg, and other places like that. So look, I was kind of keen for something to happen. I sort of written the book. I wasn't in the best time in my life. I'd gone through a bad breakup of a long-term relationship, and I was just kind of like, I was the average person that tends to go to a lot of faith healers, a young-ish woman, and it's, often matters of the heart or fertility and things like that. I was definitely open to it, but nothing happened except the stuff that he gave me. I got very high off the kind of some bush hallucinogens, and I thought I was in the traveling Wilburys for a while or something. Like I was really out of it, but still no miracle, unfortunately.
Well, fortunately for you, a few of the travelling Wilburys have dropped off the perch, so there's vacancies there. So if you could become part of them, the dream could come true, Elle.
I don't have the talent, unfortunately.
Look, it's arguable that they didn't either.
I want to pick up on the point about the new atheists, because I think a lot of people that step out of evangelicalism and out of Pentecostalism, that tends to be a port of call, is that new atheism stuff. And I agree with you. I sort of label them now as fundamentalist atheists. And you see a reaction to that online as well now, don't you, with sort of like the graceful atheists and the understanding atheists. These are some of the terms that people are using. And also, I want to also flag that Tara Jean Stevens in her Heaven Bent podcast also mentioned some of these miracles in Africa, and I think cites some of those studies as well. So even though she's moved away from Pentecostalism, she also looks at it and goes, well, I just don't know. She doesn't know how to answer those.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but yeah, it's pretty well known. I think this one study that was done out of the US, and sorry, the name escapes me for the moment. And I do cite it in my book, but yeah, I think there's maybe more of a comfort politically and spiritually for a lot of people now. I think that did sort of enter that new atheist movement when, hang on, this is as fundamentalist in many ways as the people they disclaim. And like I said, I think it just has a really nasty edge. So yeah, I think a lot of people have kind of moved away from that, and I think it's probably sounds very basic, but it's probably good that we to have a bit more of an open mind and try and be a bit understanding of other people. It's probably not a bad principle to try and move through life with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just to step back a little bit just into the history type stuff, because, some of our listeners wouldn't know the history, just as I didn't know it that well, but also those who weren't involved in Pentecostalism may be also interested. So, you note that a lot of Pentecostals are historyless, or at least ignorant of their own movement's beginnings. You trace those beginnings of Pentecostalism to the Azusa Street revival, and two of those main players were Charles Parham and William Seymour. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Some of those things that came out during your research and some of those, I guess, that early history of Pentecostalism.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it fascinated me just talking to a lot of people around the world, and even in America. Around the corner from Azusa Street, I spoke to a, really considered young Latina woman who converted and was very pious, and she'd never heard of William J. Seymour or Azusa Street that, was literally around the corner. So it is quite interesting. But, I think part of Pentecostalism is always kind of looking forward. So that's, just more the temperament. But I actually traced it a little further back than Azusa Street to Charles Fox Parham's a revival almost in Kansas. So I went out to the house there. It was actually bought by a Catholic church, and they get the odd pilgrim out there. But yeah, he was an itinerant Methodist preacher in Kansas in the late 19th century. They said he could say 250 words a minute, and he fell out with Methodist hierarchy pretty quickly as a young man, and he was really interested in healing. He and his young son had both had a lot of sickness. And he was, really interested in that. And also taking on there was an increased interest in the Holy Spirit and in, speaking in tongues, which had been confined to a few monasteries basically since the days of the apostles. I think there's some evidence in the Dark or the Middle Ages that it was almost seen as like a sign of possession that needed to be exorcised from people by some people in Catholicism. So it was really not something that was much done, but there's certainly some evidence that was popping up in parts of America as things were at the time. It was such a melting pot. It was such an interesting place at the time. But Charles Fox Parham and his followers had an all-night prayer and fasting ritual on New Year's Eve of 1901. And eventually the spirit came to a lady in the congregation called Agnes Osman, and they all thought that she was speaking Chinese. Quite a lot of early Pentecostals set sail to places like China and died pretty horrific deaths of dysentery and stuff like that when they got to this land and couldn't speak the language. But the congregation kept praying. Parham, it came on him a few days later. I think he thought he was speaking Swedish. And they, sort of started spreading the word as he would, and were fairly ridiculed in the press. And this is also, Topeka, Kansas. It's a pretty small place. But Charles Fox Parham went, wandering around the area, so Texas and Oklahoma and places like that, spreading this new bent on theology. In 1906, down in Houston, Texas, he was setting up a little school down there to, preach health and healing and the spirit and tongues and all of that. And a black man, the son of freed slaves, came to join William J. Seymour. And he, because of Jim Crow laws, he actually had to sit out in the corridor and take his instruction from Parham. And Parham was pretty, I think he was probably fairly of his time, but he was, pretty standardly racist as well. But they obviously had some sort of relationship because they did go out preaching together. And Parham had preached to the whites, and then, Seymour had got a turn preaching to the black people. And Seymour really seemed to, he was a real true believer. He converted to, I think, Methodism or something along the way in his travels. He the South was becoming a pretty brutal place for black people. And he had actually lost an eye to smallpox when he went up to Cincinnati and worked in a factory. And he saw that as a sign of God because he delayed what he felt was the call to minister. So when he saw Parham, he was, really kind of had a real fervor for it. And I think it was just one of those perfect moments of history, where a whole lot of stuff comes together. But so Seymour took this on and took it very seriously. And it was complete opposite of Parham. He's a really pious, quite austere kind of man. And he went up to Los Angeles. He was invited to preach up there and started, telling the congregation about these tongues and all these gifts that could be bestowed upon you. And the church wound up locking him out. They thought that he was a madman, basically. But he had a small group of followers, and they rented out a place and, did several nights of they were prepared to go for weeks of prayer and fasting rituals. And then the Spirit came on the congregation, and it sort of exploded, in a number of people at once. And it was a really profound moment. They wound up falling through the floor. So many people were coming over days and days to see this. But I think what's really interesting, and why Seymour is kind of credited as the father of Pentecostalism, not a white man, I always think that's quite interesting, is basically because of the press. So Los Angeles was pretty buzzing, place at the time. It was the end of the frontier. People were coming from all over America and all over the world to work there, and they had a, suitably large and vigorous press, and the newspapers started printing these wild accounts. And I quote some of the journalism in there, like you'd never get away with that today. But it really excited people. But interestingly, it also, the day that it hit the papers was the same day that news of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 hit the papers. A lot of people thought that was a sign of the end. They were all pretty premillennial back then. And so that really kind of heightened the urgency, and more people were coming to the church and getting swept up and feeling the Spirit. And it really just started taking off around America and then the world from there.
Did you have a look at the way it sort of came to Australia as well? Like when we were raised Pentecostals, that's where it came from, right? It was the Azusa Street revival.
Yeah, so that's interesting because different, sort of different Pentecost groups. Yeah, some people just aren't historical at all, and some are. I did a little. Did you ever learn much about Dowie?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So he was. So I didn't really trace the early origins in Australia, but he was quite an interesting figure. So yeah, John Alexander Dowie. He was born in Scotland, I believe.
Yeah, and he had a sort of a utopian society group, I should say. Today we'd call it, a Waco-esque sort of enclave, wouldn't we?
Yeah. So from memory, I think he was in Adelaide, and then he went over to Illinois, and there was a group of formed, like you say, almost a utopian community that I think was called a carefully devised large-scale platform for securities fraud. So yeah, there was quite a lot going on around that kind of Illinois area at the time that, taking this on, because Amy Simple McPherson kind of came out of that crowd.
See, it's funny you say that about the securities fraud, because I studied Pentecostal history at my AOG Bible College, and that was never mentioned, right? He was just this utopian kind of trying to put together this community, and it was all lovely. If anything, we kind of looked at the Dowie story and went, oh, maybe you want to be more in touch with your community rather than withdrawing, but certainly nothing about securities fraud. We did not learn that in Bible college, Elle.
Did you, did they teach you about Wilbur Believer?
No, I don't remember.
He was a guy that was, I think he deposed Dowie and took over, but he was something. He was a really prominent flat earther, and the various people he kind of intersects in a lot of history. I saw someone doing a history of them that wasn't really to do with Bible stuff, and he popped up. So he was a pretty nasty dude, I think. But yeah, sort of one of those just strange people that pops up. And in the end, he was involved in the downfall of Charles Fox Parham, where it was rumoured that Fox Parham was a sodomite, and flyers and stuff were spread around before he'd go into towns to preach, and he was kind of just cast out by everyone. And Believer had something to do with that as well.
Imagine that, Brian, secretly gay Pentecostal preachers.
I can't imagine.
No.
And child abuse, or, who knows? I mean, God, wouldn't have happened. You did just touch on Amy Semple McPherson, and when you talk about her in the book, you call her a kind of a proto-televangelist. Tell us a bit more about her.
Yeah, she's such a fascinating woman. So I kind of picked who I thought were three of the most important, influential figures to really tell the story of early Pentecostalism. There's so many others, obviously, but Simple McPherson was the third that I chose of unholy trinity, I suppose. And she really, they said that she had an incredible knack for a crowd. She could just sense an audience waning. And I think that's really, from the earliest days, that's what Pentecostals have been great at. It's a politician skill. I often liken it, I've spent time with met a few of, really big preachers with private jets and things like that. And they do have that incredible thing that I remember always hearing about Bill Clinton, that you're in a room full of people and they make you feel like you're the only person in the room. Just that really intense charisma in both sense of the words. And she certainly had that. So she, her and her first husband sort of left that group in Illinois and went off, and he died of dysentery in Hong Kong. They never even made it to China. As missionaries, and she sort of had a Salvation Army stage mum who was always sort of pushing her to the front of the crowd, and her mother was sort of the dominant figure of her life. They were sort of always falling in and out. But yeah, Simple McPherson started preaching. One of the things Pentecostals have always been good at is, if you're good at it, you can do it. You can be a woman, you can be a black man, and she really polished up some of the edges of it. Obviously, it was getting a lot of people in the door from its improvised nature and just sheer exuberance and that, but it was also clearly turning some people away, and certainly other evangelicals and Protestant groups looked down on Pentecostals. And so she started, doing these road shows that were quite flashy. She put the people who were slain in the spirit and speaking in tongues inside tents so that she'd, welcome more people. Sold grave plots next to hers, I think under the slogan "Go Up with Amy." Had a car with a sort of big banner on it that she'd drive around America, and she might have possibly been the first woman in the world to have a radio station. There's some dispute about that, but if she wasn't the first, she might have been one of them. And so she just really had that sense early on that there's this modern media that we can use to spread the word in our way, and she really grabbed a hold of it. And again, it's just one of those things. Pentecostals have had an uncanny knack. In the 60s, prosperity gospel was really spread through those quite enterprising preachers who realized that syndicated radio was a huge thing to get. You didn't just have to preach to your local church. You could preach to all of America while they're driving around. And then again today, no one does social media in the Christian world better than Pentecostals. There's just always been that incredible knack that there's just something that runs through the movement in that way. Simple McPherson was super fascinating. I mean, she said that she was kidnapped. It's never been proven if it's true or not. The trial was inconclusive, I believe. And she turned up a few weeks later. But there were rumors that she was seen driving up the coast with her lover. Her second husband divorced her he filed papers for saying that he'd been abandoned by her. And she certainly fidelity wasn't her strong suit, I think it's fair to say. And, she, just one of those classic kind of popular evangelists who seems to have a really incredibly flawed personal life.
What have we got now? A cheating, adulterous televangelist. That's another thing we don't see in modern Pentecostalism.
Yeah, exactly. But then she was quite interesting. Then she kind of politically, before World War II, she travelled a bit, and she saw speeches by, I think, Hitler, Mussolini, and she met Gandhi. And quite early on, especially the Pentecostals, really isolationist, really had no interest in what was going on in Europe. And she took quite a strong stance on saying that both fascism and communism were huge threats to the world, and people should take more notice, and Americans should get involved. So that's quite interesting. She was very ahead of her time, and she was a real Zionist. Really believed that they should create a special state for the Jewish people. I think back in the 30s she was saying that. So she was quite interesting. Yeah, she just sort of had a sense for prevailing winds, and that sort of thing that's really hard to define, I think. And then quite tragically, she almost sort of went on a speakeasy tour when she'd sort of fallen out of favor quite a bit. And she started the Foursquare Gospel Church, which is still going strong in a lot of places. And then sadly died of a drug overdose I can't even remember exactly when, in the 40s, I think, late 40s perhaps.
See, again, we didn't hear any of this in my fundamentalist Bible college, right? It was,
No.
For sure, this is all, news to me about Amy Semple McPherson. It sort of begs the question, is it that Pentecostalism lent itself to this entrepreneurship, or did people like her set the precedent and that set the culture for Pentecostalism? What do you think?
I think, I mean, look, it's hard to know, but it seems to me that Pentecostalism has a lot in common, say, with, like as I go into a fair bit in my book, the sort of populist right today, because it's that really experiential, not fond of expertise. It's about what you feel inside of you. I think that's always just, but by its nature, that's always been so big to Pentecostalism that it lends itself to those sorts of characters and that sort of politics.
Yeah, and I think that's even more so now. I mean, you've got so many different brands of Pentecostalism and so many beliefs, and it's a world of craziness. And one of the quotes in your book, which sort of lends itself to that, which we want to explore a bit further, is that you say that heresy is no longer a theological issue, but a political one. Talk us through that. What do you mean by that?
It's so hard to disentangle because it is really just kind of caught up in the political moment right now. But I think if you look around at most of these really populist leaders that are really shaking things up around the world, the Pentecostals were notably kind of some of their first and earliest backers. So Trump, Pentecostals were behind him well ahead of evangelicals. It was Paula White Cain and people like that who were. Paula White Cain is quite interesting. She's quite at the forefront of a lot of stuff that's going on. She was really getting into, I think, was it the demon sperm thing that kind of blew up, but, really getting into the ideas of spiritual warfare and demonology that are a lot more prominent in the global south, but that Pentecostals in the West are starting to pick up on a bit more. Duterte in the Philippines had a very prominent Pentecostal backer, Apollo Quilby, who's in a bit of trouble now for sexual abuse. Alleged.
There's a theme.
Also quite famously said that he once stopped an earthquake by yelling at it. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, he, really had the Pentecostals behind him from early on as well, although there is an election this year. It's looking like he's kind of lost them, but I think it's probably going to be harder and harder to say the specifically Pentecostal voting bloc behind Bolsonaro, because so many Brazilians are Pentecostalizing. Like, it's pretty much in the process of taking over Catholicism as the primary religion in Brazil, which is pretty crazy because I think it was a few percent of Brazilians were evangelical or Protestant in the 80s. And it's, just in 40 years almost overtaken Catholicism, which, was 500 years. So that's crazy. But yeah, the heresy ideas, really fueling some of these religious doctrines that aren't, they're not the only thing motivating, say, the radical right in America. I talk a bit about Seven Mountains Mandate, which I think is really gaining prominence in some parts of the Republican Party and the religious right, the radical right in America. So it's not everything, there's many things motivating people, but I really think it is the theological wing. And if people are, that way inclined, it's, fortifying them and giving them, hyping them up. Some people who listen to these particular preachers like Greg Locke and Lance Wallnau and Andrew Womack were, directly inspired to do January 6th stuff, with everyone was there as an army of lone wolves with their different inspiration. You got your QAnon guy, you got all different kinds of guys, but you definitely had some people who were directly inspired by things like the Seven Mountain Mandate and some of these very politically charged Pentecostal preachers. I was watching a lot of them during the pandemic when everyone, shut in and you could sort of doing these nightly broadcasts on Facebook. And you can really see, I think, when people lost that, in lockdown, lost that sense of community and maybe bouncing ideas off your friends and them saying, oh, that's crazy. You can kind of see people going down these rabbit holes by sitting there watching this stuff each night. So it certainly is melding a pretty dangerous kind of, I mean, I don't need to explain it too much to you guys, but really melding a dangerous sort of political Christianity that is, there are some people in America that are essentially calling for, Christian dominionism again. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are very much on the Pentecostal side of things.
Speaking of the Seven Mountains Mandate, I found an article on the Seven Mountains Mandate a little while ago, and I shared it with a friend of mine that's still attending church. And he said, oh, this is a beat up. This is, not really going on, etc. And I wonder how you feel about that. Like, from an Australian context, the Seven Mountains Mandate may just seem like American craziness. But at the same time, you're giving us, evidence that no, it's not just American craziness. It's really happening there. Do you think it's something that we in Australia need to worry about, or do you think there's cultural walls, sort of burying that from us?
Yeah, I really don't think it's an issue in Australia, and it drives me a bit crazy because I've just been doing so many interviews the last few weeks, and everyone wants to talk about Pentecostalism in Australia because of Scott Morrison and Hillsong. And a lot of people do pick up on the Seven Mountains Mandate. I'm just like, look, it's just not a thing here. Like, you might have one or two people that have got into this stuff online. But I think it definitely is. It's very uniquely American and of the moment. I haven't really heard people outside of America talking about it, but I'm sure it'll get around a little, if it suits someone's purposes, for sure. But it really speaks to the American moment, which is that they've, the hard Christian right, has lost the democratic battle, and they're losing the demographic battle. So they don't believe in the, things that they used to claim to believe in. And so they're just going straight for Christian dominionism. And this is kind of a bit of a, kind of sexy bent on it, I suppose, if, for people that are that way inclined. I don't think it's the only game in town for a lot of believers, but, one of the original authors of the book that sort of brought it back to life 10 years ago was Bill Johnson from Bethel. He was the co-author with Lance Wallnau, and Bethel's a pretty prominent church that, Sean Foyt, I can't say his name properly, the long-haired anti-lockdown guy, always doing those huge anti-lockdown concerts. He's a Bethel guy. It's as important to America as Hillsong is to, Australia, and Bethel's also very much with Hillsong one of the leading lights of this third wave of Pentecostalism. So I think it's pretty significant that he would author something like that. They try to distance themselves from it publicly because they're quite savvy in terms of their PR, but obviously, if you didn't believe it, I don't think he would have co-authored it. And then, one of the big promoters of Seven Mountains Mandate is David Barton, who was vice president, I think, of the Texas Republican Party for a long time, and is very influential in politics and gets involved in some of the very shadowy networks. My friend Ann Nelson wrote a great book, The Shadow Network, of these far-right and Christian groups that are behind a lot of these Republican Party policies, Koch brothers funding and all that kind of stuff. And he's very involved in that. So I don't think it's just so easy to say it's a fad and to ignore it when you do have a senior Republican figure and a very prominent evangelical in Bill Johnson. Bill Johnson was at Toronto Blessing, and he was one of the people that Wagner said was part of the New Apostolic Reformation, and he's really much part of that clique. So I do think that it's significant in that way. As for it coming to Australia, I just don't think that there's the political or social will or incentives for it to happen. In America, just electorally, you need to fire up your evangelical base if you're on the right with this kind of stuff. In Australia, we have compulsory voting. That's going to turn people off. It's never going to get to be a political thing. And something like Hillsong, which is probably I'd say is a fairly huge chunk of Pentecostalism in Australia. I mean, you go there and it's just diverse, multicultural kids under 25 there for the music, basically. I can't see them getting fired up by that kind of message. And if anything, they'd probably get turned off by it.
What's interesting, though, is that Bethel has a real influence in the churches here. When I was doing some research into Pentecostalism in Australia and looking at what's going on in their websites, a lot of them are connected to Bethel. Maybe not politically, but that sort of school of supernatural ministry style stuff.
Yeah.
That does seem to have like there's a church in Melbourne called Stairway, which is quite a big one. They are officially tied to Bethel. There's Assemblies of God or Australian Christian churches that align themselves with Bethel as well. But it's funny, because we talk about the Seven Mountains Mandate and saying it's not going to be much of a push here, yet we do have a Pentecostal Prime Minister, and we do have quite a few Pentecostal winners of things like Australian Idol and The Voice and stuff like that. So whether it's actually a real threat, they do see the fruit of it, and I'm sure they're quite happy with their prayers.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing, which I try to touch on in the book, and again, it's something that I got from some people in academia that's been writing about this stuff. Independent Network Christianity is a really great book by Richard Flory and Brad Christensen, and also Andre Gagne, who's an academic in Canada and an ex-Pentecostal preacher himself. They've all written really well about how this third wave of Pentecostalism is really it's not just about saving your soul, it's about transforming society. It's really moving ideas of being born again from, liberation and restoration to conquering. And I think that's really significant. And that's where it is worthwhile, understanding the Seven Mountains Mandate in that context, in that it is this Pentecostal movement is really coming into its own for the way that it gets people wanting to do transformational things for society, sometimes for better. In South Africa, sometimes it's the only thing you can do because there's no jobs, everyone's corrupt, and so that's how people fortify themselves and are creating their own almost parastate through their church. But then, the other end, it's some of the most venal people on earth, to my mind, in America, that just want to conquer things almost for conquering's sake.
And I guess with that politicisation that you've spoken about, I mean, one thing that politics really loves is war. When we were in the fold, disciples and soldiers of Christ were often interchangeable, lending to that idea that we're at war.
We used to put on the full armor of God, didn't we? And, we had the sword of the Spirit and the helmet of something and
a breastplate.
Yeah, the breastplate of righteousness. We used to gird our loins with truth. Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
Now I gird my loins with my bonds undies, but once upon a time, gird with truth.
Well, it was there, and it's very warlike type prayers that you would pray as a Pentecostal. So you speak about that Pentecostal ideology being driven by that war agenda, and we're at a war to win souls and those sort of things. We both experience that. Tell us how that played out in the interactions that you had while you were researching for this book.
Sure. I mean, like I said, it can be difficult to explain because, you sort of say a lot of people are interested in social justice, but perhaps not in the way that social justice is a real pejorative thing. Again, if you look around the world, the majority of Pentecostals and Pentecostal converts are usually young women. So they're not, necessarily, I'd probably say overwhelmingly, the type of people that are getting, politically mad and want Christian dominionism and things like that. So it is often very community first focused. But certainly you do see angles. I mean, you hear, a lot of stuff about the Great Commission. That to me is probably the overwhelming thing. One of the most, one of the most prominent sort of doctrinal things that you would hear around the world was the Great Commission. And I think that is, again, really inspiring to a lot of people, but you can also see how people can take it a lot further. So it just invariably seems to have a political edge to it, and it's hard to necessarily nail down why. I think it's probably something to do with the fact that Pentecostals have always been so great to speaking to the here and now. Someone said to me in a favela in Brazil, the Catholics told us we can have a good life in the next one. The Pentecostals told us that we can have a good life in this one too. And that is, that's a pretty powerful thing. And, I think it's pretty fair to say that Pentecostalism is, on the whole, globally, the religion of the working poor. There is just so much about the here and now that it speaks to, that I think it's just, and maybe it just is the times that we're living in, that it just kind of can't not be political. It's just, to nail down exactly why and how, because it looks a bit different everywhere else. Conditions are a bit different. It's a bit difficult, but the edge is there because it's speaking to people's material needs.
You spoke in your book about the failure of the state in some of these countries, especially some of the developing countries, and about how Pentecostalism, you touched on it then, but how Pentecostalism is helping people out of things like addiction and helping them out of poverty. When I first heard this on another interview you did, I thought to myself, yeah, that's true. And I've seen that in my friends' lives, even here in Australia. But it comes at a cost. Like, that, yes, they'll help you out of poverty, they'll help you out, but then you've got to buy into all this, you've got to buy into Pentecostalism, basically, and then it's almost impossible to leave. What did you see in some of these other countries, right? You focused on Brazil, Korea, Nigeria. What are you seeing in terms of them meeting where the state has failed?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most interesting thing to me in my book. So I kind of go back to it a bit. Is that, because everyone, been doing a lot of interviews over the last few weeks, and everyone says, "Oh, prosperity gospel. I mean, isn't that awful?" I'm like, wow. Thing is, there's a lot of evidence that it works. Especially out of Brazil, it's been pretty well researched, and basically, because people tend to get their lives together when they join a Pentecostal church. And because we're really still quite early on in the Pentecostalization of things, people are coming to it as born again. There aren't so many people that are born into the faith. And, longer term, I think maybe that'll stop the slow and maybe stop the power of it when you're just kind of raised like that. But in places like that, people are converting actively to Pentecostalism, having that born again moment, having that narrative of what went before and what comes after. And that demarcation really seems to speak to people. They, tend to get their lives together. They've got an accountability network around them. If you're having problems with a drink or whatever, maybe it's just getting up early in the morning for church is just something that stops you maybe going out the night before. And also people's material conditions tend to improve. I sort of spoke to a few people, and there's certainly examples of, your Pentecostal preacher is, they're probably, in your poor little town on the edge of the rainforest or your favela, but they, your Catholic priest was probably educated in Europe. They're probably white, and they were just kind of dropped into your community. Your Pentecostal preacher grew up with you in the same streets, knows what it's like, mixed race like you, same, dialects and lingo that you use. And the relationship is often very much like a mentor that they have with their parishioners, and they very aware of competition. So, they are really charismatic and do tend to get quite involved in the lives of people, for better and for worse. We'll say, we'll go start that small business you've always dreamed of, and I'll encourage the congregation to go shopping there, and stuff like that happens. And so they're really building up solidarity networks. South Africa as well is very much the case. And like I said, it's really, millennials in South Africa so horribly let down by the post-apartheid era. They were promised that they were finally going to get their time, and youth unemployment 75% in South Africa. Corruption is just absolutely horrendous. The state services are always crumbling, and the church is often the only place that there's somewhere to take the kids after school while you're working 2 jobs to make ends meet. They're doing soccer practice and doing a bit of music, and they're not running out in the streets with 75% youth unemployment. So people, it just seems to get people's lives together a bit, and it really is those networks. And another really big driver to Pentecostalism is people feeling alienated in big cities. I don't think it's an accident that things like Hillsong really takes off in these really big global cities, Moscow, Sao Paulo, Cape Town, Los Angeles, London, because people, go to these cities from their small town or their, small country in Africa or whatever, and they just feel alienated. And it's just a bit of a community, it's somewhere to sing and dance and meet people a bit like you with similar interests and maybe similar temperament or things like that, meet a partner. Nigerians, Pentecostals are really great at organising speed dating because they know people stuck in the Lagos traffic. So, it's just all that kind of stuff that, as I keep coming back to, Pentecostals are just great at speaking to people's needs in the here and now. And there's certainly a lot of evidence that people's lives do tend to improve once they join Pentecostal churches.
That's been a big theme in our podcast, hasn't it, Brian? That community is something that a lot of people that leave Pentecostalism, that's what they claim to miss the most, is that community. But I also want to resonate with some of the other religious communities we see around the world where they support one another. And that's the success of like Jewish communities around the world where they do exactly that. They come together, they support one another, they shop at, each other's businesses, et cetera. And they do, and they prosper as a community, not just as individuals. So it's interesting that that's the model that Pentecostals in developing nations tend to be adhering to.
Well, I think it's a sociological response, which is under the cover of a theological response. And, people say, it's God that this is happening, but it's a really good community mindedness. And it's really a really good sociological model, which I guess connects people. It does bring success. But they say it's God. It's the reason you've come here. God's doing this stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I find the sociological stuff around it really, really interesting. But sometimes it is a bit hitting your head against a brick wall because you kind of ask people and they say, "Oh, it's God." One of the things that drove me a bit mad writing the book was saying to people, especially some of the dodgier preachers, that I was following around South Africa that are doing some really extreme things, turning petrol into pineapple and giving their congregation shots of petrol and eating live snakes and getting very rich in the process and having, Rolls Royce for yourself and your wife and all that kind of thing. And say to people, followers, really, really devoted, and they absolutely love their guy, you know. And I say, well, what do you like about him? And they say, oh, he's such a man of God. And I'd be like, but what about that, you know, and it was so hard, and I could just never get a satisfactory response. And I kind of just had to, in the end, say, is it, and this might be too reductive, I'd be interested in your thought, but is it almost just like saying, like, why do you love your football team? Like, I love Arsenal. Oh, I hate them as well because they make my life miserable most weekends. But, you know, and it's like if someone kind of asks you, why do you love them? And it's kind of, oh, well, they're the best, you know, or I love them, you know. And is it, yeah, it just kind of felt to me that it was just such an intangible thing, but people feel such a connection with their preacher and often cannot explain it.
Yeah, and look, I think it's that community thing. I mean, we've spoken about this in the podcast that I definitely overstayed my time in Pentecostalism and overstayed my time in Christianity as a whole, not because of the draw of God, but the draw of community. You know, the draw of, you know, it's a one-stop shop. It's a place there, like you've spoken about, Elle. You know, it really does bring that connectedness. It brings that sense of well-being overall. So you're leaving that behind, and you've got to start again. It's like moving countries, even though you might stay in the same suburb. So it's a world you're so immersed in, and extricating yourself from that can take a long time, and it takes a bit of bravery for some people. But it's because of the stuff that you've said.
And there's also an authoritarianism too. Like, we can't downplay that. As much as,
Yeah.
you know, everything that you're saying, Elle, is 100% true, and we agree with you. But there is also the dark side of this sort of authoritarianism. And so they are taught to, you know, Pentecostals are taught to, you know, touch not the Lord's anointed, don't challenge your leaders, etc. And so, you know, they may not know why they love their leader, but they have been taught that that's the answer to give. In all truth, internally, they do genuinely believe that they love their leader, and that's part of the package of Pentecostalism. You accept Jesus into your heart, you become part of a local community, local church, and you know, submit to the leadership and the eldership in the church.
Yeah, very, very much so. That sense of leaving community is something I've really really noticed over and over again. When people do leave the church, it is really at a personal cost. Of losing, you know, sort of feeling like you have to start your life over again. So yeah, it's certainly something that you do see time and time again.
Absolutely. Look, we are coming to a close. We are coming to the end. I guess, you know, you really immersed yourself in that Pentecostal world. You went to South Africa, you went to South America, North America, and where was the other place you went?
Yeah, I went to Korea, South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria, quite a few states of America, the UK, Brazil, Guatemala.
We like Guatemala because we used to have a friend of ours in church that's how he spoke in tongues. He would repeat the word
True.
Guatemala over and over again. We're not making this up. So he'd sit there in meetings going, Guatemala, 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 Guatemala. Yeah. I'm going to seek for an interpretation now.
Yeah, so no, definitely. Like I said, I do love a good excuse to go and travel to places, but you know, it is pretty interesting. There's not a lot of things that, oh, I don't know, maybe there are a lot of things, but yeah, seeing something that's happening on such a global scale, but is also so localized, was yeah, really interesting.
I mean, we asked before, did you encounter a miracle? Did you get that miracle? You've said no, but during that time, do you think you encountered the divine?
No, I didn't, and I was quite open to it, almost wanting it to happen, you know. And I, you know, read about there's I think it's the great Pentecostal scholar Alan Anderson. I think I heard from someone that, and gosh, I hope I'm not wrong, but that I think he was another denomination and went up studying Pentecostalism and you know, feeling that the Spirit had come to him and converting. So I was kind of interested, and someone had told me that they'd heard of other people that sort of academics and things that got into it and then converted themselves. So yeah, it's almost, so no, it's like, yeah, would have been almost cool in a way to have that experience because, like I said, I'm open to it. Don't know if I'd make a great pious person, but yeah, but no, just sadly nothing there, and yeah, I guess to me maybe that's the most interesting thing. Maybe that is the hand of God at work, that I really probably came out of it with a more open mind than I went into it.
So you've come out with an open mind. Would you say that your agnosticism has shifted then?
No, just no. I think it's just the very boring, old-fashioned idea of just maybe learning a lot about people and understanding them a bit more, and breeding some respect out of that, perhaps. And just as I said, I mean, maybe it's just the way that I, put this into context in my way of understanding. It was, through very political, sociological, kind of material edge, and really understanding, doing a lot of interviews and getting asked about all this stuff and saying, well, you've got to, prosperity gospel tends to work for people, and that kind of stuff. And I think that stuff is the really interesting things, is really understanding what it's giving people in the here and now. And look, if I'm a young woman in a poor community, I'm probably converting. I mean, why not? You give it a shot. People tend to believe in most other parts of the world much more than we do in the kind of secular Australia. It was just, like I said, I met some wonderful people, met some absolute living saints, and met some of the biggest crooks and charlatans you'll ever find. So that to me is, that's kind of the story of Pentecostalism.
And then the continuation of that story would be then later on you would lose your faith and start a podcast, because that tends to be what happens, or at least engage the sort of ex-evangelical community. Hey, Elle, I really want to celebrate your book again, because it is wonderful. And for those of us that have lived this, it's even more meaningful. So the book is called Beyond Belief, How Pentecostal Christianity is Taking Over the World, which we will also affirm, at least they're trying to do. Where will people find this book?
All good booksellers. So it's out, on Amazon and places like that, and in bookstores. It came out in the UK in late November, but there's been global supply chain issues, so with printing, so it hasn't been that easy to get there. It's out in Australia at the moment for sure, and it should be out in America in about a month, and I'm shortly going over there to do some stuff for it.
Awesome. Get it, read it, people. If you can't get a paper copy, go buy a Kindle or some other device. Kindle is not our sponsor yet, but get one, whack it on there and have a read. It is a fantastic read, and it's super, super interesting. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. Thank you so much for the discussion today. An hour has gone super quick, so it's really interesting to chat to someone who's been so immersed, and also someone who hasn't been in the scene, someone who has come from an outside look, reasonably objective from what you're saying. You were really open to it. Nothing happened, but it's just been great to chat with you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm just glad that it kind of passed the muster of people that know what they're talking about far more than I do. So I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, totally. We learned a whole lot from you, from both the book and also this interview. So that's it from us, Brian. I guess next week there's just going to be more of the same, more teenage fundamentalism, or at least post-teenage fundamentalism.
There is. I can't remember what we got next week, but it doesn't matter. Just tune in next week and have a listen.
Yeah, it's a podcast. Who listens in order? All right, mate. I'll see you next week.
Alrighty. See ya.